So let's work backwards a little bit. This is kind of the state of play right now. He's been forced to resign. There's this incredible uprising. And then maybe at the end of the conversation, we'll loop back to what might come next and how this momentum could continue in a positive way, hopefully, not a negative one. But take us back at least a little bit to the creation of this control board and how that relates to a really important legal decision in 2016 that sort of solidified what I guess I would certainly call, seems pretty obvious to me, colonial status for Puerto Rico, and how that relates to this control board and these sort of broader systems of power over Puerto Rico, of which maybe these politicians are almost like subcontractors of.
Definitely. And let me give you a broader historical context.
Please.
Puerto Rico was held up by the United States throughout the Cold War as an example of how capitalism would thrive in the developing world and how capitalism could bring people up. It could bring them up from poverty. And of course, it was a challenge to the Soviet Union, which was holding up Cuba as an example of development. And in order to be able to hold up Puerto Rico as a beacon of hope for using capitalist policies to develop a country, they had to phase in a series of tax incentives through the U.S. tax code. However, opposition began to grow within the United States against these tax incentives within the tax code. It was known as the 936 section of the tax code. So the Clinton administration decided in the mid-1990s that they would phase out these tax incentives. By the mid-2000s, these had effectively been phased out. And of course, a lot of manufacturing corporations that had headquartered or had started to develop factories in the island almost immediately left the island. Some, of course, have stayed, and it's still an important sector in the island. But this caused a huge problem for Puerto Ricans, particularly an economic problem. A lot of Puerto Ricans were employed in these sectors. Not only that, the government had developed a lot of clientelistic types of social spending, among other kinds of social spending that was really the result of important labor struggles in the island of Puerto Rico. So this ushers in a time of fiscal crisis, which of course coincides with the 2008 crisis, the global financial crisis. So this becomes a perfect storm for Puerto Rico in financial terms. Puerto Rico, by virtue of being a colony of the United States, does not have access to bankruptcy as other places in the United States do, like, for example, Detroit, which had its own fiscal control board and had access to bankruptcy. In order to have access to bankruptcy, a bipartisan group of legislators in the U.S. Congress were able to pass a bill that is known as Promesa, which translates, ironically, to promise. What Promesa did is that Promesa would form an unelected board of technocrats whose job was to balance the books and to pay folks who were owed money. These included folks that had pension funds that had invested in Puerto Rico bonds. It included hedge funds that had bought this out of pennies out of a dollar in bulk and were now demanding that they get paid the entire dollar out of that debt, which they, of course, bought for very cheap. So Promesa is ushered in, and in 2016 and onward, they begin to mandate, and they have the power to do so through Promesa Act, a series of austerity measures. This includes slashing the higher education budget almost by half over a series of years. It includes reducing dramatically government spending across a subset of areas of spending. And of course, this begins to lay bare the kind of colonial grip that the United States had over Puerto Rico. It's important to note that Puerto Rico, prior to Promesa, it only really had one last remaining form of autonomy, and it was fiscal autonomy. Puerto Rico had the autonomy to create its own budget. And its lost that under Promesa, which can, as they've done already, send the budget back to legislators and the governor and say, sorry, we don't agree with this, cut more. And that's, in fact, what they've had to do. They've also had the power to negotiate directly with folks who are owed money and to develop negotiations and agreements between them without any sort of input from the Puerto Rican population that stands to lose all these social services.
So, and actually, can we just take a really brief detour here? Bernie Sanders voted against Promesa, is my understanding. I believe Tulsi Gabbard voted for it, even though she's made a whole show of flying out there.
And people did not necessarily receive her with open arms. They do remember that.
Good. That is good to know, because that's some chutzpah. How do we know of other? How did other? So Sanders voted against. Do we know of how other presidential candidates? I just want to kind of note that, because that is a very important vote.
This is a crushing vote for Puerto Ricans, because it really took away the only form of autonomy that the island still had. Of course, the island was already suffering from a democratic deficit with very little representation in the United States. But this was passed with bipartisan support, overwhelming bipartisan support. And it's important to note that even many Puerto Ricans in the political leadership, the traditional political leadership that Puerto Ricans are now rebelling against, went to Congress and practically begged for this. Chuck Schumer, among others, Pelosi, congressional leadership. So this is very much a bipartisan bill, and there was very much consensus. Folks like Sanders were the exception to this norm of course, quote unquote, saving Puerto Rico from crisis. And one thing we hear very frequently in Puerto Rico, or about Puerto Rico, is that in the absence of Puerto Rico, let's say if Puerto Rico were to become an independent republic, that the Puerto Rico would be in crisis. And of course, folks in Puerto Rico who are critical of that discourse have said, well, we're currently in crisis, very much under the United States.
Let's go back to, can we touch on the uprising against military testing in Vieques, and use that as a bridge to what we saw in the last week, and maybe also a sense of Puerto Rican politics outside of this discredited political class? What is the left movement in Puerto Rico? What does grassroots politics look like there? And how does it connect to the movement in Vieques, and maybe even more historically, a very long-term anti-colonial effort, which even at times had some collaboration with, as an example, Irish revolutionaries seeking their independence. A lot of really interesting analogies between Ireland and Puerto Rico. But what does that, I guess, go in any direction you want, but specifically the left and movements outside of conventional politics, and the thread, at least to Vieques and the military?
For a good amount of time, the largest sector of the Puerto Rican left was the pro-independence sector. A lot of these folks were folks who objected to having a relationship to the United States out of anti-imperialist ideals, who rejected U.S. foreign policy, and who have for a long time realized that the United States had never really had a benevolent sort of perspective or policy towards Puerto Rico, and that it was very much a facade that it kept up as a way of propping up Puerto Rico as an example of how capitalism would thrive in times in which they viewed alternatives to that as a threat, such as, for example, Cuba and the Caribbean as well. The pro-independence sector was very large in the island, but it also was heavily repressed. And there were reasons for why it dwindled over time. Among other reasons, of course, there was some internal division. It was also a predominantly relatively privileged Puerto Rican male-led movement of elites, and folks objected to that. And over time, we've seen the Puerto Rican left very much diversify. We've seen the growth of a strong LGBTQ rights and justice movement. We've seen the growth of feminist groups that have had a lot of representation internationally in the world conferences on women. We've seen the growth of anti-racist efforts for the rights and justice for Afro-Boricuas, Afro-Puerto Ricans, which of course is something that is often suppressed in Puerto Rico, this notion that, yes, there is racial diversity within Puerto Rico, among other sectors of the left. So in Vieques, what we saw was one of the biggest mobilizations in our history, and it was, of course, an example for the world because in this island, folks were able to coordinate. They were able to grow a strong enough movement that kicked out the military from the island of Vieques. It's an island municipality to the east coast of the big island of Puerto Rico. It's important to note that Puerto Rico is an archipelago of islands that includes 2 island municipalities, which, by the way, are some of the most marginalized communities in the island. And in Vieques, it started with fishermen. It started with folks kayaking, like Tito Kayak. I like to refer to him as the James Bond of environmental activism because he'll climb whatever tower he has to bring about some awareness about whatever issues Puerto Ricans are currently facing, like he did when he climbed the Statue of Liberty in a very powerful image that said peace for Vieques, paz para Vieques. In Vieques, we saw politicians coming into the island and doing civil disobedience, people like Luis Gutierrez. We saw civil rights figures who came and got arrested as well. Some even served sentences in the federal prison in the island. And Vieques was our last big moment when Puerto Ricans exerted pressure on a powerful target and managed to get a huge victory. And that's why a lot of folks have been drawing parallels between the current unrest and Vieques, and that is because Puerto Ricans wanted folks to come out in numbers in these protests against Ricardo Rossello. And they compared this moment to Vieques, and they said, we need to have marches that are as big as Vieques. And a lot of estimates already say that these marches were, in fact, bigger than Vieques. And there's been more than one march that has had more than 400,000 to 500,000 people, which it's, of course, a huge number considering that this is an island that has lost a lot of people and currently only has about 3.2 million people. So that's a good amount. I know we'll know after the census how much we have now, but there's a mass migration, and in these times of precarity, in these times of struggle under these austerity measures, for this amount of people to come out in the streets and demand the resignation of Ricardo Rossello, it was a very powerful moment and surprising moment. And also, one thing that we need to know about these series of mobilizations is that the kinds of mobilizations that we saw in Vieques took years and took a lot of organizational planning and strength and resources to be able to bring out that amount of people to do civil disobedience in Vieques, to do advocacy on civil disobedience in D.C., and to march in the kind of numbers that we saw at that same time. We didn't necessarily see that. We didn't have that amount of time this time around. This happened in 2 weeks, almost, and really organically. But it's important to remember all of these groups that I mentioned that have been coming up and developing within the Puerto Rican left. There is a legacy of struggle. There was a major strike in 2010 against the Luis Fortuño New Progressive Party austerity measures that threatened public higher education, among other sectors. They laid off more than 20,000 people. So people had already been reeling from these austerity measures, and they were upset, and new groups had been formed. And so these groups were able to really inject some energy into these mobilizations through many means. It was surprising the ways in which they did that. And very creative. Folks used cultural work, direct action. They used music, and they called on their celebrities, and every well-known Puerto Rican across the world was called upon to say something and to act. And we saw a lot of Puerto Ricans abroad answering that call.
So, and that's amazing, and so positive. As we go to what comes next, and I think it's very important to contextualize, obviously, that the structure of the problem here is a colonial relationship with the United States, the structural, which is exemplified now in this Promesa board, which is administering these this ruthless plan, which if you have any sense of World Bank, IMF plans across the globe, or frankly, I mean, it's not as extreme, but if you are upset, as an example, of what Paul Ryan was trying to do with his political career, which was to, gut the social safety net and savagely increase poverty and hunger and early death in the United States to help redistribute even more money to wealthy people. I mean, this is, it's the Ryan plan times 20 for an island that doesn't even have formal political autonomy, just to really solidify that point. And now though, where do we go? And I just want to put two examples in mind. Kate Ostroff has a really good piece in The Intercept that came out either last night or this morning, saying that in this sort of period of this instability and uncertainty, the Junta board, which is what some people call Promesa, is seeing an opportunity, particularly in a sort of very inexperienced leader that will be taking the governor's place. And then Juan Gonzalez made this point the other day, I believe, on Democracy Now!, that plenty of examples, and Egypt was the example he used, of you have an incredible movement that removes a toxic figurehead, and then the system just replicates itself. So not to put a dampener on it, but what do you see as the more kind of strategic possibility here to actually reorient the situation more broadly?
I think this is a very opportune moment for broad social change, as all moments of political crises are. And it's important to note that over the past 2 weeks, when folks were out in the streets, they weren't only chanting Ricky renuncia, Ricardo Rossello resign. In fact, one of the most popular chants were Ricky renuncia y llévate a la Junta. Ricky renuncia and take the board with you. So there's a long list of targets that folks are already, if you are monitoring social media or if you have been listening to some of the Facebook Lives, you have heard that folks are already calling on the person who is expected to be the next governor to resign. They're calling on the leader of the Senate to resign, Tomás Rivera Chatz. They're calling on the president of the lower chamber of the House, Johnny Mendez, to resign. Folks know that this is a problem that is systemic and that solutions have to be crafted accordingly. And this is why today there was a major march at the Puerto Rico financial sector today. There wasn't, folks celebrated last night, but it was a short-lived celebration. And I'm sure there will be more celebrations. But nowadays, Puerto Ricans are learning that protests and further protests can be a celebration, as they showed last night when they had a dance party in front of in Old San Juan, close to the governor's mansion, and it was billed as a militant dance party, and folks are happy. They knew that they would win. During the march, the major march that took place this week, a reporter interviews a man that came from the municipality of Juncos, which is quite a ways away from where the march took place. He was an older gentleman, and she asked, but what happens if he doesn't resign? And he said very confidently, we'll take him out. So we're living in a moment where folks are pretty convinced that things need to change. We're living in a moment where we're all surprised because this is an island that has been traditionally marked by a lot of divisions, and all of a sudden we were seeing massive amounts of people, which we've never seen before, out in the streets, and people were talking. They were having conversations in public places, things that we haven't seen in years. And I think that the agenda is clear. There is a solid political leadership that's coming from the bottom up of groups like La Colectiva Feminista en Construcción, the environmentalist movement, environmental justice movement specifically. There have been folks coming. There's a coalition of folks that has been formed to audit the debt because Puerto Ricans argue that this debt was issued illegally, and thereby there are folks who need to pay. There are folks who need to be investigated, and any debt that was issued illegally should not be repaid. One of the chants that was heard on the ground was, that's not our debt, and we're not going to pay it. So people know that Ricardo Rossello was just a figurehead here, and that he was just the beginning of what could be a cascade of series of political changes that may take place in the island.
Final question. From the perspective of solidarity in the States, if you, as an example, are engaging in the Democratic primary, I guess, has any candidate, I mean, we talked about the Sanders exception on the Promesa vote. Has any candidate, would you say, has a sort of particular connection to progressive forces on the island? And if you were in a position where, as an example, you're engaging with one of these candidates or campaigns, what would be the most concrete thing to push for in terms of benefiting Puerto Rico and solidarity with left forces on the island?
It's important to take note of the fact that one of the things that was contained in the chat was that at one point the DNC had adopted a measure in support of Puerto Rican statehood, and the Ricardo Rossello party is a pro-statehood party. And in the chat, one of the things that they mention is that folks were criticizing Tom Perez for supporting statehood for Puerto Rico, and that's when Ricardo Rossello said we should defend Tom, and he referred to Melissa Mark-Viverito, who is a political leader in New York, as someone who they should attack, and of course use a series of foul words to refer to her.
She's a former she's a former head of the New York City Council, Melissa Mark-Viverito. Yeah, exactly.
Who had been critical of the DNC's adoption of a measure to support statehood. This is a moment where what we've seen, one of the most common responses in the United States from liberal sectors to the crisis that Puerto Ricans are going through is, this is an outrage. Puerto Ricans should have a presidential vote and should have statehood. What that discourse ignores is that a lot of Puerto Ricans do not want statehood. Yes, there's a number of Puerto Ricans who want it, but this is very much an issue that is up for debate. And if you ask me, what would a wise and responsive candidate for office, for president in the United States, do to support Puerto Ricans? I think it would be to support a deliberative process such as a constitutional assembly whereby Puerto Ricans could sit down and decide for themselves how they want to attack these problems, how do they want to craft solutions, and more importantly, perhaps most importantly, what will Puerto Rico do about the negative effects of its current relationship with the United States? What will be the decolonizing mechanism for Puerto Ricans? And in my opinion, that is up to Puerto Ricans to decide, not political leadership outside of it. So that may be a measure that a political candidate could endorse, the creation of a constitutional assembly, and there is in fact already a proposal for that in the Puerto Rico legislature.
Excellent. Fernando Thomas Aponte at the Scholars Strategy Network and a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Missouri St. Louis. I really appreciate your time, and thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you for having me.